Good morning, everybody, and welcome to TCC's Leadership Series. And I'm sure you all have been patiently waiting to see and hear about such a topical subject as supply chain and everything that's going on with the world. We have attendees from several continents who are participating in this live webinar now. And we also have the privilege of having some of the key business leaders and functional leaders who lead real businesses on this call. So I would like to get the panel going. I would also like to advise everybody that this webinar is being recorded and would also be circulated for future use. And with that, I would want to introduce to you our esteemed panel of guests here. So I would start first with Philippe, and Philippe Gilbert. He is the EVP Supply Chain at UPS. Philippe.
Thank you, Sanjay. Thank you for the invitation. Glad to be here. So yes, Philippe Gilbert, I'm working in UPS since 4 years, in charge of air, ocean, customs brokerage, trucking brokerage, and also contract logistics. This is the smallest part of the UPS group, which is a $100 billion company. And our smallest part, which is called SCS, is $15 billion in revenue. Thank you for inviting me today.
You know, if there are things to be understood about supply chain and trade and finance, we couldn't have had a better participant than Philippe. So Philippe, thank you for joining us on this panel. And our topical subject is, where would the CEOs of the future come from? And guess who does the hiring of CEOs, board members, leadership teams? We have an esteemed group from Spencer Stuart, and I would like to go with Hypatia, Kingsley first, and then Bailey. Hypatia, please.
Hi, Sanjay. Thanks for having me. I'm Hypatia Kingsley. I'm based in Seattle. I have been with Spencer Stuart. Yesterday was my 19th anniversary with the firm, and I am a lead consultant in our financial technology practice. And I'm super excited to be here. Spent about 10 years in China worrying about supply chain issues myself, mostly associated with the supply chain of leadership talent in China. So again, really excited about the discussion.
Thank you.
Bailey, Hallingby, also with Spencer Stuart in our Miami office. Not quite 19 years, but 10 years with Spencer Stuart. And I spend all of my time in transportation, logistics, and supply chain, recruiting in the boardroom at a C-level, and really up and down the supply chain function. Thrilled to be a part of this exciting discussion and appreciate the invitation to participate.
You know, there was a time when we would get a long service award for putting 25 years in a company. And if I told that to my son, I don't know how he would even, contemplate what that meant. So, it's good to have you. You've had a good run at this, and I think that your experience and wisdom is much appreciated on this call. We're so privileged to have Tom on this panel as well. So, Tom, over to you.
Thank you, Sanjay. Thanks for the invitation, and it's great to be with our colleagues here to talk about this very important topic. I've been in this game a long time. I think when I started at IBM, the title of the group I joined was Transportation and Materials, and it's kind of evolved from there. But supply chains are about the movement of things, movement of material. And when they move well, we all know how good that can be. And when they don't move well, we know what happens there. So, thanks for popping that up. I wrote a book with Rob Hanfield this past year called Flow, How the Best Supply Chains Thrive. And really, it's about how things move. And looking forward to the discussion today.
Again, thank you very much, Tom. Everyone who's participating in today's panel, all the panelists as well as the attendees, would receive a complimentary ebook copy, and we would be circulating that link. So wait for the instructions from TCC to receive this. So let's get the ball rolling. We're the news that if you're watching news today and you're looking at what Ford talked about yesterday in terms of their supply chain costs and so on. This is an extraordinarily turbulent time. We have inflation, we have interest rates, we've got debacles in supply chain performance, we've got issues around ports, people issues, labor, everything that you can think about is in the mix, and that drives complexity in terms of leadership decisions and how we run our companies. And so this topic, we started off as whether supply chain executives are going to be primed to be CEOs of the future, and what makes them better, what makes them qualified, what could be the blind spots, and so on. I think this is the subject that we would like to address today. By no means that we were anticipating or we are preconceived to a notion, and I think it will be presumptuous for our side to think that one function is better than the other for the purpose of CEO succession. This is to invoke the thought about the different functional attributes and how could each of the functions contribute to the betterment of companies going forward, namely today, supply chain, which is, I think, at the forefront of all the disruption. So I want to start off with Tom. You've written the book, obviously a very, very nicely written book. If you haven't read it before, I'm sure our attendees would do that now. As a practitioner, you've been in this position before and at the forefront of turbulence in your career. Right. How do you see this evolving? Can you talk about the life in the day of a supply chain exec today and how it is unveiled?
Well, again, there are good times and bad times in an economy, and wherever you think we are in that cycle, right? If you go back to 2008, 2009, you go back to 2001, you go to 95, if you go back and look at these cycles, and the word agility is used a lot in supply chains, but the ability to react and respond to how the environment changes, I think is first and foremost, right? You've got to have the tools, and you got to have the people, and you got to have the mindset and processes in order to do that. And the problem with supply, right? Supply chain, it's about supply, is there's something called demand, which is also behind the supply. So the supply usually will always rise up to meet whatever demand is, because in capitalistic societies, that's how the economy works. But it needs time sometimes to respond. A good example is semiconductors, right? I mean, it's going to take time for semiconductors to meet a demand, which really came on strong because of the rise of things like EV, Internet of Things, and other electronic devices that have caused that surge to happen, which causes a drag on a lot of supply chains based upon the lead time for those things. So I think that the effective supply chain leaders today are the ones that actually anticipate better, don't react as much, and that requires just a mindset of a planning mindset, right? Where you've got to take your horizon out, and you've got to not constantly wait for the next ball to fall or the next shoe to drop, so to speak. And I think that's kind of the environmental message. So companies that don't do that well end up with inventory that can weigh them down, because number one rule for a supply chain person is working capital and inventory and movement of things. I defined in the previous book I wrote, The Living Supply Chain. Supply chain is defined in 3 words. It's really about the movement of things and movement of materials. So when it moves well, it's the movement of cash and cash flow and working capital, and you have effective free cash flow generation from a supply chain. When it doesn't move well, you have inventories that can weigh down your balance sheet. So I think that's kind of the model. A lot of people, I think if you go back to the 90s and the early 2000s, everybody got focused on cost and low cost. And because of low cost, things globalized at a rapid rate because they were chasing labor arbitrage. And when you find the low cost, sometimes that's far away and you can't see it as well. So you end up with this dynamic of, maybe you're helping the income statement, but the weight that it put on the balance sheet, I think, was heavy. And so now chief supply chain officers are maybe not taking their eyes off cost, but also recognizing the impact that the movement of material has on cost and on revenue and on customer sat and all the other levers that a company needs in order to be successful. So to me, that's what's exciting about this. And I think supply chain officers are in a great place to understand what the business is, what's happening in the business clearly, and then some of the levers necessary to actually improve the business.
You use the word working capital and cash management, cash to cash forecast, and how do you build in free cash flow. It's incredible how supply chain execs are tied at the hip with treasury and treasury is tied up with supply chain individuals at the moment. When I say individuals, we talk about leaders at running either BUs or functional heads, and it is very difficult to dissociate functional aspects of supply chain from treasury, finance, product launches, new product builds, manufacturing setups, and so on. So I think supply chain touches almost all the functions one can think about. It's the whole value chain that you would touch. And I have seen supply chain execs can be in the know of what's going on in the company at all, across the board. And I think they're very attentive to that. In the last, say, COVID 2 years, supply chain individuals and professionals who were buyers had to also be sellers. They had to sell to their suppliers. They had to sell to the ports. They had to sell to UPS and others to get, allocations and capacity on board your train, planes, buses, as well as material allocations. So I think they've played both sides, and I think that's a really good experience to get, especially for individuals such as us, who were rotated through various departments in our pathway to becoming a CEO. So with that, I want to get to Philippe. Philippe, you move materials, and you are in the middle of everything that Tom talked about. What are the shifts? What do you see in your life?
Well, clearly what you are saying, Sanjay, about turbulent times, that's what they have seen. The visibility inside the companies for CSO has never been greater. So when we take back 2020, CSO was clearly recognized by the CEO to supporting, you said it, the sales efforts, and therefore a key component of survival during the pandemic, because, well, it was difficult to be able to sell at that time and adapt to that. In 2021, what is amazing is that due to transportation inflation, congestion, you talked about it, labor shortage, the CFO was noticing much more the CSO functions via the budget, inventory increase, you said it, Tom said it too. And adapting from the just-in-time to the just-in-case, that has created a lot of costs for companies. And now we are in 2022, and still turbulent times ahead. Brought the war, the energy crisis, potential recession. CSO are now expected to review sourcing, adapt the mode of transport from air, ocean, or other modes, and reduce cost of transportation. So based on this, I would say that the CSO and his supply chain partners will continue to be at the forefront of conversation in the boardrooms, from sourcing to inventory, to delighting customers also with timely delivery. In view of cost inflation and diversification of sourcing, the CSO will be in the front line to bring solutions. That's clearly what we are seeing at UPS. We talk to many customers daily. Many are redefining as far as their supply chain partnership, cost, visibility, reliability, and flexibility. So we have adapted also ourselves to their needs, and they have adapted to our operation to be easier to work with and invest as per their requirement, our customer requirements, in new technology. We set up in a record time 2 digital platforms who are customer engagement platform, but also we put even more automation and robotics to cope with the labor shortage. Customers are looking for that. In the past, I recall when we were talking about that, customer was like, maybe not, a bit too expensive. Labor arbitrage was not there. Now, automation and robotic, we talk about it every time because they are CapEx, and also they have a great source of potential productivity gains. So this is what, at least at UPS, we believe that's our purpose, which is the purpose statement that we have got, moving our world forward by delivering what matters. But during the pandemic, I think what is very important, and the supply chain in general, we became more of a trusted advisor for our customers to help them navigate the complexity that they were having in their supply chain.
You know, it's interesting you say this, and add to that ESG goals, and add to that all the other complexities that are expected. So there's more and more expectations from the department going forward, isn't it?
Indeed, clearly, and that's one of the change that I see in CSO more and more. But I think you are going to ask more questions about that.
Yeah, you know, I do agree with you. I used to run a supply chain consulting sort of division in Europe, and I had one of the supply chain heads complain to me once, Sanjay, in our monthly management meetings, I don't get to speak. And I said, what's going on? And so we were running supply chain software as well as services. And the complaint was that, well, in the management meetings, the salespeople get to speak first, and then the finance people get to speak first, and so on, and everybody speaks. And then it comes down to they call staff functions. And in these staff functions, you would have IT. If it ain't broke, very good, thank you very much. And that's God bless you. And supply chain, okay, if the factory is worked and the fulfillment worked and everything's working fine, God bless you too. And then we'll see you in the next meeting. And he says, that was fine, but I need a lot of things to be done and taken care of. So how do we get to the attention? All of that changed in 2020. And then everybody was chasing supply chain heads to make sure that their life works. So this is the kind of leadership paradigm that has changed. Culturally also, there's a lot of change. So I'm going to turn it over to Hypatia and then to Bailey in terms of what you see in your you get to see far more deeper insights, I would say, than most of us, because you have direct conversations and some of what you say might not be public. But whatever you can share with us in this regard will be really appreciated.
Do you want to go first, given
Sure.
that you're CEO direct? I'll talk from the finance side of things.
Yeah, and it builds on what Tom and Philippe shared. I think historically, the supply chain function has been looked at as being more tactical and execution oriented. And I think what we're finding is there's been a need to elevate the function, and the functions become more strategic. It needs to align with other functions throughout the business. As Philippe was saying, it needs to rise up and have a true seat at the table. And to Sanjay's point, have a voice in the discussion of executive leadership team meetings and board meetings as well. So again, becoming still a need to be tactical and to execute on a day-to-day basis, buying, selling, you name it, but at the same time align with the strategic initiatives of the business, particularly global and international businesses. And I think part of that is reshaping the scope of a chief supply chain officer, and ideally somebody who has more breadth than a straight line path in just procurement or just planning. Ideally, they've had planning, procurement, some manufacturing operations experience. They've done a few trips around other functions and had commercial exposure, operational exposure, maybe even financial exposure. So it's creating a more well-rounded supply chain leadership role that I think has broader business perspectives and can therefore be a stronger business partner to a CEO, to divisional presidents. And Hypatia, I don't know if you have anything you'd build on that.
I would. I think that the other recognition that has come about since the pandemic, which was already there, but has been reinforced, is the linkage between money supply and movement of things. And given the crises that many institutions went through in their supply chains and how to move their capital efficiently at the same time, I think that the importance of supply chain officers was elevated due to some of the financial challenges that many institutions went through. Colleagues of ours, Bailey, Alex, Ju, and Maria Fong in Asia did a great article about supply chain officers' systems thinking. The idea that supply chain officers function in this liminal state between all of the operating components of the company, and they need to sort of cultivate resilience, self-organization, this notion of automation, and subsystems of hierarchy that can serve the institution a lot more readily. When you think about that same set of qualities, resilience and self-organization and hierarchy, financial systems need to work the same way as efficiently. So I do think there is a lot more placed on the strategic value of chief supply chain officers now than there has been before. And when you bring in institutional investment in the financial ecosystem into this situation, you're also adding then this impetus for other things to be taken into account: geopolitical situations, ESG imperatives. You had Jamie Dimon talking in front of the U.S. Congress recently, saying that are we robbing Peter to pay Paul here and not transitioning appropriately? So I do think there is absolutely more focus here. And I think the imperative is, for certain institutions, is existential.
It's interesting you bring this out. And, we've been in turbulence over the last couple of years already through COVID and the pandemic. And now we might be for another few years. So I think that people have just got to get used to being in turbulence for the next 3 or 4 or 5 years. We don't know whether it's going to be a stagflation, a recession, or what happens. We are going like live into a Space Mountain ride at Disney, not knowing which direction this thing is going to be headed. Only thing you can have is your seatbelt fastened to your chair and make sure that you don't fall off that ride, which is called safety stock, buffer stocks, everything to do with margin of safety. But Tom, here's an interesting question back to you. Over the last couple of years, we had more cash and less parts. I think it's going to be a little bit of a reversal on that, where there's going to be less cash and a little bit of more flexible availability and components and shortages subsiding a little bit. But one way or the other, there's going to be something in constraint, and everything is going to go through supply chain at the moment. So when you look at liquidity being important in a stagflation or recession, it's going to be interest, how to use your capital wisely. And we have the CS, or the Chief Supply Chain and Procurement Officer, right in the middle of the same question that we were dealing with last year. So you want to comment on what makes a good supply chain officer?
Well, I think, first of all, it's looking at financial outcomes and their improvements that are possible with an effective supply chain. So, oftentimes, supply chain officers will have procurement reporting to them. They'll have inventory management or materials working for them. They'll have logistics working for them. They'll have other parts and components of the movement of materials into the factory and warehouses in some cases. So they see and have control over levers in the income statement. They have controls and levers in the balance sheet, and they can affect revenue through, the effective delivery of final goods to customers. So, and you could even argue customer sat is buried in there too, because, customer sat comes from satisfying customers' requests. So a supply chain officer really is looking at all these levers. And I think in a close alignment with the chief financial officer and the chief supply chain officer is critical, both in terms of what the expectations are, going forward. I mean, when you're in a public company, it's all about your guidance and what's coming next. So you've got to make sure you're accurate. And when you're not accurate, bad things happen. And so, there's no excuse for surprises, which means that you've got to have great visibility. In order to have great visibility, you got to have great tools today. The digital environment and the toolbox that's available to people now in the last 10 years is just totally opened up the aperture about how deep you can go in a supply chain. I would even argue that as recently as 10 years ago, we were operating two-dimensional supply chains. Two-dimensional supply chains are transactional: purchase orders, invoices, acknowledgements, all the stuff that moves commerce around. But with the tools that are available today, you've got 3 dimensions. You can actually look into what's going to happen next, tomorrow, next week, next month, because you can see where the raw materials are coming from and whether there are issues in risk or resilience or opportunities for efficiencies in that visibility. And so that 3-dimensional change is kind of like where I think a lot of chief supply chain officers haven't done enough yet to mitigate risk, to manage resiliency better, but they're available, they're well known now. And I think that's really important to invest in those things in order to make sure that the tools available give you that 3-dimensional view. And then when you get into ESG, you're starting about transparency, which is the 4th dimension, right? Where you're talking about, how do you actually see things how do they reflect back on you? Are you sourcing that, that material correctly in such a way that it satisfies the goals and objectives of the corporation in terms of ESG? So I think there's all that in the role of a chief supply chain officer today that really is making that role incredibly important, much more so probably on the tail of this pandemic, right, than it was going into it. And whenever you have a problem, as we all know, we have an opportunity. So I think if supply chains are a problem, and how many cocktail parties or meetings have we been at where people start with, "Oh, you're the problem." You almost don't want to say you're in supply chain. It's kind of like almost a dirty word, but it's with that, I think, is an opportunity.
It's really interesting you bring this out. And I think there's a question here about how supply chain can be more strategically involved in the CEO's agenda. And I know that now the CSOs and the CEOs are far more intertwined, their calendars and their catch-ups and so on. But you personally, you have skipped the CEO position to be straight onto the board, almost like leapfrogged into a level of responsibility that goes beyond just the next level of promotions, but to get the board agenda and the governance, and as well as maybe a risk management function associated with it. Do you see your life changing? And then I want to ask the same question to Philippe as well, because I'm sure you've been approached by several people to support their strategic agenda with your expertise. So, Tom, if you can highlight your experience.
I think it's rooted in stakeholders and stockholders, right? I mean, investment community now are looking at the skill sets at a board level, and Bailey and Hypatia are better to talk about this than me, but they're looking at where they have gaps. And there's a lot of different ways that boards look at their membership, but supply chain now is something investors are asking for. I mean, it's not coming from inside, it's coming from outside. So I think that's a difference that I've seen happen more recently, because that expertise, I think, is kind of important, as we all know now. So that's one thing. The second thing I would say is that the role internally, I know, some people may struggle to get onto the agenda of the CEO or the board, but I think a lot of companies now, the chief supply chain officers I've been talking to, they're up first. They're up first now. They're not the afterthought, maybe at the end of the agenda. They're let's go to supply chain first, and then let's see what we can do from a sales standpoint. After we understand that. So I think that's a big change.
Very interesting. Philippe?
Yes, so I will reflect on the CEO role. The CEO role requires, to my view, a good understanding of the geopolitical environment. It's changing a lot, including elements like nearshoring, regionalization of sourcing, trade imbalance, cost of transportation, you named it, Tom, inventory location, that might enable for faster delivery to customers and therefore to sales. So I believe, depending on all that, the vertical market also depending, the CSO role is a key function to support the CEO and the leadership. As a confirmation, I would say that we hosted, UPS hosted a roundtable with our top 20 customers end of 2021, and we invited top CSO. A majority of them were directly reporting to the CEO, a proof that the CEO has been closer and closer to the complexity of his supply chain to provide the best experience to his customers, either B or C. And also another element, which I think it's quite interesting. I recall a conversation with a very well-known brand retail company CEO telling us, we used to think that supply chain moving was at the switch of a button. And during the pandemic, my board started asking me questions about it. So I had to engage. So that's why he was in front of us, to be able to engage. And now he wanted to understand how we can orchestrate, how we can plan their supply chain. So definitely logistic leaders are thinking differently with their supply chain today. And they need to think about resilience. I think we talked about it without telling the word. Resilience of their supply chain, their visibility is very important, but more important is going to be the predictability. And for us at UPS, we want to be a tech-enabled end-to-end supply chain orchestrator for our partners and our customers to give them a better experience. And the ultimate goal is customer satisfaction. So we anticipate a lot this next disruption, and that's maybe when, with support of supply chain teams like UPS, the CSO will turn to be a CEO. That's what I believe, but it's very much linked, to my view, to vertical markets who are so essential in the global world. And to answer back to your question about the boards, I would say that's a very interesting. Yes, there is more and more request about it. Mm-hmm. I think that there is a desire at many companies, and I would say more the middle-sized companies who are listed, to be able to bring on board a supply chain knowledge at the board level. So there is going to be, like I would say, digital also is becoming a big element, and digital and supply chain are very intertwined. So this combination of expertise from a digital perspective and a supply chain expertise, that's where I see a few questions coming up to me on that.
It's very interesting to see how this particular function is now blossoming into what we call as a chief risk officer, if you will, and then maybe a chief diplomat, because you've got to go to maybe 10 different countries, not all of which you want to get along with you very well, but you still need to buy, move, and deal with them in some shape or form. So I think the manifestation of all of these different attributes are being thrown into the mix for supply chain execs to be leaders of tomorrow. And one wonders whether the old school of getting rotations done through different departments is actually still a good idea, and whether somebody can just take a pit stop at supply chain functions and just get to know the entire genesis of this function with a 1 year, 2 year rotation, or should it be the other way around? So I think, Bailey, I'd like to go with you first in terms of CEOs, the expectation from the boards of the CEOs over the next 5-10 years. Do you see any transformation there, any changes coming out of the last few years? And if so, any guidelines on that?
Yeah, and I think we're absolutely seeing certain trends. The period we're living in and have lived through for the past couple of years, we have seen CEOs come straight from supply chain functions, or CEOs with supply chain experience. It's not quite as straightforward as let's just promote chief supply chain officers to CEOs. I think you make a good point, Sanjay, that it's part of a rotation, and the best CEOs have spent ample time on the operations side of the business, the commercial side of the business, the financial side of the business, but there's an increased emphasis on having spent time in the supply chain function, and a pit stop probably doesn't work. And I've heard you say it yourself, there's no such thing as a pit stop in supply chain. To really understand it and get your arms around it can take some time. So while we haven't seen a huge uptick in chief supply chain officers being parachuted into a CEO role, I do think it would be interesting to look at the data a couple of years from now, having just gone through this period, seeing how the chief supply chain officer role is becoming a more well-rounded role, and seeing how many CEOs ultimately have supply chain experience in their background before moving into a CEO role. And I think back to the board question for a second, Tom makes a great point about it being investor driven, and we hear about diversity on boards, and that's typically gender diversity and ethnic diversity, but there's diversity of thought, right? Every board needs an audit chair and a finance expert. There's, in the board work we do at Spencer Stuart, there's an increasing ask for functional diversity of experience, and that is becoming more heavily weighted on supply chain, where executives like Tom are being asked to sit on corporate boards for exactly that reason.
I think that's right. I think a couple of other just sort of trends that lend themselves to the supply chain skill set. between 2021 and 2022, I think we saw a significant uptick in the new class of S&P directors with international experience. That, I think it's half of all of the new S&P 500 directors have international experience, meaning they've actually worked and lived or are from other parts of the world. Supply chain exists because we need to globally supply goods and funding from other places around the world. So there is, again, this opportunity for supply chain executives to have elevated presence and inform and advise in a few different levels. That functional leadership, to Bailey's point of diversity of thought, is, I think, well represented through this skill set at the board level because of the enterprise nature of that skill set, and also because it's a convergence area of a lot of different stress points for the company. So there is the opportunity for a board to sort of examine macro issues through the lens of the supply chain.
This is getting to a very interesting development for CEO training, as well as for all these young MBAs who are perhaps graduating from high school and listening to us here. When I say high school, first year of MBA school ends up being like that. And then by the time you graduate in less than 18 months, you know how it is. I think global experience, getting an expat position, so somebody from Germany working in Southern California, for example, all of those things are important culturally to understand your supply chains, just not on the phone. You've lived in China, and I think you have to be in India, for example, to understand how the traffic there works and so on. To be able to forecast a supply chain comes along with the task to be able to forecast the culture and the ramifications associated with it. And I think and that's just going to become more wider. So I think that's a really interesting point. We have a couple of nuanced questions here that have come up. Is the compensation of a supply chain officer now undergoing a change in order to address this need to be more than a supply chain officer? Do they get compensated? Do they get more stock options or something? And is there a reduction in their compensation bonuses associated with direct supply chain outcomes? And that may be, Bailey, I don't know, you have compensation, so perhaps you might be in a better position to say that.
Yeah, I think it's, not to oversimplify, but it's supply demand, right? We've gone through a period where highly talented and qualified supply chain leaders have been in high demand, and demand is outstripping supply. And with that, we move up the cost curve, and I think it's driving compensation higher. I know our CFO practice, not to go off topic, but is seeing a similar phenomena where the demand for high quality CFOs is completely outpacing the supply, and therefore price tags are moving up. Not that we put a price tag on a person, but the question was asked about compensation. So
I would also say that generally in sort of the fintech side of this equation, that folks who have a digital supply chain capacity and can demonstrate automation and other kinds of technologically enabled efficiencies, those are the highest priced folks.
I would agree totally with that. There is an element also when you're looking at the supply chain inside the structures, the seniority is quite high. So you are going to have a succession plan, if not put in place, that is going to, and there was, I would say, and I'm part of them, I would say, there is a seniority who is there, and there was a lag of experts who had a global vision and not just very drilled down to one product. So you have a drop on the talent disparity. So here, I think that's going to create first a need, and you see more and more. I've never seen so many classes, MBA classes of logistic, of sourcing, of planning, digitally connected, because they are always with the digital element. And yes, this combination of retirement, who is coming very strong, plus a gap in the seniority of the population on the logistics side will create, I believe, this increment on compensation.
Thank you. Our next webinar, by the way, is going to be technologies that drive trade. So I mean, take your inputs for that one too.
Interesting.
We have a question here about, how do we get supply chain teams to be more involved in strategic decision making? And, Tom, McKinsey stands for strategy, and you're talking about supply chain and strategies together. If I can sort of translate this question into saying, if the CSO was to be put in charge of investors' relations, for example, and get in front of the investors, because now they're the guys who are actually leading the results and making sure the results come by, as well as the risks are addressed. Do you think CSOs have gotten the pathway to get to strategic levels of conversation and then also to board levels and investors?
Yeah, I mean, just going back to financial outcomes, because at a board level, a lot of it ends up there. The velocity or asset velocity, to use a term, asset velocity of material is in the financial statement usually reflected in turns or days of inventory or days of supply. So if you get a handle on what a supply chain can do to turn the knob to reduce days of supply through using alternate instruments of moving inventory off your books or moving it faster or other efficiencies in that equation, you can generate more free cash flow. And when you generate free cash flow, the CFOs do M&A. They improve their return on invested capital by investing in their business, right? Or they can do stock buybacks. So there's a lot of advantages to being a cash machine, the cash machine of the company. And I think somewhere along the way we got lost in cost. I don't mean to be cute about it, but we got lost in cost at the expense of really cash. And especially if we are headed into a downturn, and I'm not saying we are, but if we are, cash will be king. So I think the abilities to have conversations with a CFO and a board and a CEO about these things in a visionary, strategic way. Okay, now if we want to reduce days of supply by X, what investments do we need to make, in what tools, in what places, in what time, in order to do that? And that's the strategic discussion. In other words, things that you do today that affect tomorrow. So those, in that analysis and that thought process, really brings into focus, sharp focus, the different opportunities that you have in front of you to make those decisions. So that's how I would come at it, really from a more, strategy, right, is important, and you got to understand your own culture when you do that. But what is it that you can do to actually move the needle out in time, not necessarily today. Chasing parts. We've gone from hunters and gatherers over the last few years to hopefully farmers again, where we can actually build on this. In fact, I grabbed a mug this morning that said Farmer's Diner. I don't know where it came from, but but the point is, it's growing things again and building things.
This brings such an interesting point to culmination. I think there are tools, and we already know that in supply chain there are tools for planning and execution and demand planning execution. You talked about that. Several ERP solutions, the bolt-on solutions for track and trace, etc. This whole area is now expanding and exploding. I was use the word, with different bespoke tools that are best in class, developed by technologies, and we want to address that in the next session. Also, finance and supply chain coming together. So there are trade finance tools, some of them in the hands of banks, some of them in the hands of maybe software companies, and then some of them are independent inventory that could be handled neither by A or B, and which is where we play a reasonably prominent role. I think I would like to take any closing comments from you. If you were to be on the board right now talking to the HR department of a company, and your head of HR is sitting in front of you where I am, what word of advice would you give to the CHRO on how he or she should be thinking about organizations of the future? So let's go with, I would like to go with Bailey, you first, Hypatia, Tom, and then Philippe.
I think the comment I'd make is strike the right balance between near-term needs and long-term planning from a talent perspective. I think there was a lot of knee-jerk reaction in the last couple of years because there had to be, and a lot of changes were made. But I think Philippe made a really good point that a lot of companies have found their bench isn't that deep, and succession plans are needed. And even if you've found the right chief supply chain officer for today and for the near term, he or she will need to be succeeded at some point. And it's really important and critical to build, the branches below that individual and strengthen your team further so that there's continuity of strength and talent going forward.
That on the digital side, there have to be more, if indeed rotation into supply chain becomes something that would be regarded as essential in order to create the skill set for future leadership CEOs and C-suite, then how are you building in sufficient innovation incubation in supply chain? Where is the digital sort of API developmental capacity? Where are your software engineers who want to be supply chain officers?
Excellent. Tom?
Yeah, I in the last two jobs, I remember in the interview process, talking to CEOs or CFOs, I'd say, do you want a chief supply chain officer that is responsible for the supply chain, or do you want one that's accountable for the supply chain? And it's a bit of a trick question, right? Because of course, everybody says, I want you to be accountable. And I think a lot of chief supply chain officers are too responsible and not accountable enough. And for that reason, I said, okay, that means everybody's hardwired to me. There's no dotted lines. I want my own IT requirements function inside supply chain so I can paint the picture of what needs to be done. And by building that kind of a capability, you can develop a great and strong chief supply chain officer function, because it's about too much dilution of responsibility and not enough clear accountability, I think is a weakness that's happening. Let's all remember, chief supply chain officers didn't exist until the 80s when they were first named, because people say, well, we got to pull this stuff together. It all fits together. Before that, it might have been sourcing or procurement or transportation was separate. And, but somebody put it together and said, wow, we can really move the needle here and control the flow and stuff. So I think that's important. I think, people need to take the opportunity to have that kind of conversation, because when you're accountable, then you have control, and then you can do something and you can make things happen. If you're just responsible, you got to negotiate. And negotiation is really a drag on the system and time. So that would be my takeaway.
I would reflect on the UPS strategy on that, because I think that's I enjoy very much the arrival of our new CEO, Carol Tomé, and she put the strategy saying customer first, people led, innovation driven, and those are the fundamental things that drives us, at least in supply chain, and I think they should drive a lot of people. Customer first mindset is essential. We are talking today in SCS, and I'm talking with the CSO who are talking about the customer experience, and it's relevant to their brand valuation. So imagine these elements from a tactical to a completely strategical part. CSO, we're never talking about that. The people led is the one, and you voiced it many times. So back to your question on the CHR, talent is a key element, especially for service companies like ours. So people-led, the pandemic has created those super elements, labor shortage and remote work. The CEO role and the CSO role is to be an ambassador and attract and retain these talents. The DE&I is a key element of the DNA of the companies, and reflective, I believe they need to reflect the customer market. Sustainability too, when we are talking with millenniums and more, They are asking, what is the sustainability of SCS? What is the sustainability of UPS? They are challenging us for that. So, and interesting enough, during those roundtables that we have had a lot of CSO who are also sustainability officers, which are quite interesting. And the last one, back to what you were saying also, is the impact of role change on innovation driven. That's the last element of ours. The tech and data needs to be there. There is no way in supply chain and for any company to say the digital part is not there. We need to have it. It's a way to communicate with our customers, to connect with them, with our partners, and partnership is a big element also that we have shifted very strongly in UPS, how we manage partners, how we collaborate better, and the way we move products, the way we provide feedback to our customers. The data analytics are going to be critical for tomorrow leaders. So yes, talent is key, I would say, for at least UPS. We have a workforce of 500,000 people. I can tell you, when we need to flex in and out on peak for 100,000 people, that's not easy. And it's every year a challenge. And you need to just, you need to be very good at it. It's an expertise to be able to go for it. Sorry, a little bit long answer.
No, that's perfect. As a matter of fact, I'm going to use that. You know, the best way to get to the C-suite, the CEO suite, etc., is to make redundant yourself in your current role. And you can only do that by hiring people better than you. We already know this. It's not a cliche. It's a real deal. And so I think for CSOs, my message would be to expand the horizons of their functions, not only for the present, but for the future. And so also in their departments. I want to thank all the questions that we have received here from different attendees. I'm sure we are able to handle many of them, but if not, we would answer them by email. You would also be getting the book written by Tom. So do write to us on tcc@tradecapitalcorp.com. And the next session is going to be absolutely on digital connectivity, which platforms work, which platforms do not work, what should be the emphasis of supply chain executives, and how to make sure there is no gap between what I call the cup and the lip. So everyone, thank you very much. I also want to thank our fabulous marketing team, which is Ritu, Yang, Alexander, Leo, and Cyprian, to be able to make this webinar a very well-planned and executed event. So thank you, everyone. And I look forward to seeing you again on 11th of November, Tech That Drives Trade Finance. Thank you very much.